Imagine a 10-year-old girl running through a crowded market, her voice trembling as she describes a man who looked at her with eyes that didn't belong in a civilized world. This was little Marie on March 9, 1980, in Ambato, Ecuador. The Plaza Urbina was a place of routine, medicinal plants, local crafts, and electronics, but that day, the air felt heavy. Marie ran to her mother, Carlina Ramon, breathless and terrified, describing a man with a filthy appearance who had been stalking her with a predatory gaze. Immediately, Carlina reacted. She alerted the other vendors and customers, pointing directly at the man. He was gaunt, disheveled, with chaotic hair. Sensing the growing agitation of the crowd, the man attempted to flee, but a group of women blocked his path, surrounding him before he could vanish. Cornered, he collapsed to the ground, shielding his head from the impending blows. He screamed that he was a good person, that he was only looking at the market and had never harmed anyone. The police arrived just in time to prevent a lynching, leading the man away to a nearby cell. They had no way of knowing they had just captured the most prolific serial predator in history, Pedro Alonso López, the monster of the Andes. To understand the monster, we must return to October 8, 1948, in Santa Isabel, Tolima. Pedro was born into the heart of La Violencia, a period of total social collapse and civil war in Colombia. His mother, Bernilda, was pregnant when his father, Pedro, was murdered by conservative militias. Left widowed and in a war zone, she fled to El Espinal, carrying a burden of chronic panic. When Pedro was 4 years old, his world fractured. His mother revealed that the man raising him was not his biological father. This revelation triggered a profound disattachment. He began to view his stepfather and siblings as enemies. Domestic life was a cycle of brutal physical punishment, and he was forced to witness his mother's survival in the sex trade, separated from the acts only by a thin, tattered curtain. By the age of 10, after his mother cast him out for a minor incident, the psychological disintegration was complete. He vanished into the streets. Pedro walked to the capital, surviving as a street child, scavenging through garbage and using hallucinogenic substances to numb the hunger and the cold of the Andes. At 13, after a traumatic episode of abuse by a teacher who had briefly taken him in, he retreated even further from society. Years later, an attempt to return home ended in violence after his mother discovered him attempting to abuse his youngest sister. He was cast out forever. In 1969, he was sentenced to prison for car theft. Behind bars, the victim became the predator. After being subjected to brutal assaults by other inmates, Pedro planned a calculated revenge, ending the life of his primary attacker, an act that earned him a terrifying respect among the prisoners. Upon his release in 1978, he made a lethal vow: he would never be the victim again. Free from prison and fueled by a deep-seated resentment toward society, Pedro Alonso López began his predatory cycle in 1978. His first confirmed victim was a 10-year-old girl near the Tequendama Falls, a massive and mist-covered waterfall outside Bogotá. He used a tactical, calm approach to gain her trust, engaging her in a seemingly innocent conversation before leading her away from safety. In his chilling confessions later given to authorities, López described a ritual he called a loop of power. He would strangle the child until she lost consciousness, watching the life fade from her eyes. Then, he would wait. As she lay limp, he would gently tap her face or wait for her to gasp for air, bringing her back to consciousness just to repeat the strangulation once more. He admitted to doing this multiple times with the same victim, finding a sick satisfaction in being the master of the thin line between life and extinction. Once the victim was dead, he continued his grim ritual with the body, later sleeping next to the remains as if they were a companion. He stated that during these moments, his body felt a happiness he had never known, a realization that turned his depravity into a lethal addiction. Driven by his newfound compulsion, López crossed the border into Peru. He adopted a nomadic lifestyle, moving through the high-altitude plateaus and rural villages where he could target vulnerable children without drawing attention. He focused heavily on indigenous communities, believing that their deaths would be less likely to be investigated by the central government. During his time in Peru, he claimed to have murdered between 50 and 100 children. He moved like a ghost through the Andes, using the vast and rugged geography to hide the evidence of his crimes. However, the logistics of his invisibility eventually faltered when he was detained by local authorities. Surprisingly, he wasn't caught for the murders, but for lacking proper identification and travel documents. Instead of investigating further, the Peruvian authorities decided to simply deport him back across the border, unknowingly releasing a monster into the heart of Ecuador. When he arrived in Ecuador in 1979, his hunger became uncontrollable. He no longer waited months between crimes. The intervals shortened as his psychological disintegration accelerated. In the province of Tungurahua and the city of Ambato, children began to disappear at an alarming rate. The local population was paralyzed by fear, and the government was eventually forced to declare a state of emergency to deal with the wave of missing persons. In April 1980, the earth itself seemed to demand justice. Heavy seasonal rains caused the Ambato River to flood, eroding the soil of the surrounding hills. As the waters receded, they left behind the remains of 4 young girls. These discoveries confirmed what the community had feared. A meticulous and relentless predator was operating in their midst, turning their beautiful mountains into a vast, silent graveyard. Once in custody, Pedro Alonso López was not the trembling man from the market. He adopted a new persona, a humble, misunderstood traveler. Captain Pastor Cordoba, a seasoned investigator, realized that traditional force wouldn't work with a mind like this. Cordoba changed his tactics, treating López with a simulated kindness, offering him food and engaging in long, casual conversations to lower his psychological defenses. The strategy worked. López began to talk, initially complaining about how unfair the world had been to him. But when the conversation turned to the missing children of Ambato, his tone shifted from victim to predator. He didn't just confess, he boasted. He spoke of the victims not as human beings, but as muñequitas, little dolls, that he had collected across the continent. He claimed that they were now in the power of a special being, referring to himself with a disturbing sense of grandiosity. To prove his claims, López agreed to lead the authorities to his secret burial sites. What followed was a journey into the heart of darkness. He walked the police through the rugged Ecuadorian terrain with the precision of a surveyor, pointing to seemingly unremarkable patches of earth. "Dig here," he would say with chilling indifference. Each location he identified yielded the same horrific result: the remains of a child, often buried in shallow graves in the very places where they had once played. The forensic investigators were stunned by the sheer scale of the operation. López watched the exhumations without a shred of remorse, sometimes even providing details about what the girls were wearing or the last words they spoke before he initiated his loop of power. One of the most haunting moments of the investigation took place at a small, isolated tin shack. There, the authorities found the remains of Ivanova Yakome, a case that had paralyzed the local community. The evidence found at this site confirmed his signature, the specific method of strangulation, and the post-mortem desecration he had described in his cell. Although López claimed to have murdered over 300 children across 3 countries, the harsh reality of the Andean climate and the passage of time made full recovery impossible. In Ecuador alone, the authorities were able to recover and forensically link 57 bodies to him. Each one was a testament to a systemic failure of protection and the arrival of a predator who had mastered the logistics of death. In 1981, the Ecuadorian judicial system faced a frustrating reality. Despite the overwhelming evidence and the recovery of 57 bodies, the penal code at the time did not allow for the accumulation of sentences for multiple murders. Pedro Alonso López was sentenced to 16 years in prison, the absolute maximum penalty allowed in Ecuador during that era. While in Garcia Moreno prison, López remained an enigma. He showed no remorse, often telling other inmates and journalists that he had done the world a favor by cleansing it. Behind bars, he maintained a high level of physical activity, perhaps preparing for the day he would return to the world that had failed to stop him for so long. In 1994, after serving his time in Ecuador, López was deported back to Colombia to face charges for the murders committed near Tequendama Falls. The Colombian prosecution utilized witness testimonies, including that of a mother who recognized him from television as the man who had abducted her daughter years prior. However, his legal defense requested a comprehensive psychiatric and medical evaluation. The results concluded that Lopez was in a psychotic state and was therefore deemed inimputable, legally insane. Under Colombian law, this meant he could not be held criminally responsible for his actions because he allegedly lacked the consciousness of the gravity of his crimes. Instead of a prison cell, he was ordered to be treated in a psychiatric facility. Lopez was transferred to the psychiatric wing of the Modelo prison in Bogota. For several years he was a model patient. He exercised daily, watched television, and read books, showing no signs of the violent compulsions that had driven his cross-continental hunt. By 1998, the medical board and the press had largely forgotten the magnitude of his depravity. He was declared cured and granted his freedom. The conditions for his release were simple. He had to report regularly to the authorities and continue his psychiatric treatment. But the moment Pedro Alonso López stepped onto the pavement and felt the open air of Bogota, he vanished. He never reported to the prison, he never saw another psychiatrist, and he never left a trace of his whereabouts. Today, the monster of the Andes remains a ghost. Some believe he died in the mountains he once terrorized. Others fear he simply moved to a new region, adopting a new identity and a new logistics of invisibility. He remains a permanent shadow in the history of Latin American crime, a reminder of the hundreds of innocent lives lost and a justice system that, in the end, let a monster walk away into the mist.